In the dimly lit chambers of the Palazzo Vecchio, where shadows danced across ancient stone walls and the weight of history pressed down upon every decision, there lived a truth so stark and unforgiving that few dared to speak it aloud. This truth, born from the crucible of political turmoil and human ambition, would echo through the centuries as one of the most profound insights into the nature of power, resilience, and the human condition itself. The year was 1513, and Florence had just witnessed the return of the Medici family to power. In a small, cramped room outside the city walls, a man sat hunched over his desk, his weathered hands moving across parchment with the precision of someone who understood that words could be more dangerous than swords. Niccolò Machiavelli, once a trusted diplomat and secretary to the Florentine Republic, now found himself cast out from the very halls of power he had once navigated with such skill. Yet in this moment of apparent defeat, as he reflected upon the rise and fall of princes, republics, and empires, Machiavelli began to perceive a pattern that would fundamentally alter how humanity understood strength, weakness, and the brutal mechanics of survival in an unforgiving world. The observations he made during those long nights of exile would crystallize into principles so enduring that they would outlast the very political structures they sought to describe. The first of these brutal realities struck him with the force of a revelation as he contemplated the fate of Cesare Borgia, a man who had once seemed invincible but who had ultimately fallen victim not to external enemies, but to his own fundamental weaknesses. Borgia had possessed armies, wealth, cunning, and the backing of his father, Pope Alexander VI. Yet when fortune turned against him, when his father died and his enemies circled like vultures, it became clear that all his external advantages could not compensate for the internal frailties that had always lurked beneath the surface. This realization led Machiavelli to a profound understanding: the greatest threats to any individual come not from external forces, but from the weaknesses that reside within. The man who allows fear to dictate his decisions, who permits comfort to soften his resolve, who lets others define his worth, such a man carries the seeds of his own destruction wherever he goes. No fortress can protect him from himself, no army can defend him against his own limitations, and no amount of wealth can purchase him the strength he refuses to cultivate from within. As Machiavelli's quill moved across the parchment, he began to understand that this principle extended far beyond the realm of politics and statecraft. In every sphere of human existence, from the merchant's counting house to the soldier's battlefield, from the artist's studio to the lover's embrace, the same fundamental truth applied: those who conquer their inner weaknesses become unconquerable by others, while those who remain slaves to their limitations invite destruction from every quarter. The process of destroying one's weak self, Machiavelli observed, was not a gentle reformation or gradual improvement. It was a violent, painful transformation that required an individual to confront the most uncomfortable truths about their nature, to acknowledge their failures without excuse, and to systematically dismantle the comfortable illusions that had previously sustained them. This destruction was not merely psychological or spiritual, it demanded concrete actions, difficult choices, and the willingness to endure short-term pain for long-term strength. In his mind, Machiavelli could see countless examples of men who had undergone this transformation. Julius Caesar had destroyed his reputation as merely another Roman politician to become a figure who would reshape the world. Lorenzo de' Medici had abandoned the comfortable role of merchant prince to become a patron and politician whose influence extended across Europe. In each case, the individual had made a conscious choice to sacrifice their weaker self, the self that sought only comfort, approval, and safety, in favor of something harder, more demanding, but ultimately more enduring. The man who seeks to destroy his weak self must first acknowledge that this weakness exists. This recognition requires a level of honesty that most people find unbearable. It means looking in the mirror and seeing not the idealized version of oneself that the ego prefers, but the actual person with all their limitations, fears, and failures. It means acknowledging that the comfortable narratives one tells about past failures may be elaborate justifications for present weaknesses. Most painfully, it requires admitting that many of the external circumstances one blames for unhappiness or lack of success may actually be reflections of internal deficiencies. Machiavelli understood that this process of self-examination was only the beginning. Recognition of weakness, while necessary, was insufficient. The weak self had to be systematically dismantled through deliberate action. This meant forcing oneself into uncomfortable situations where old patterns of behavior would no longer suffice. It meant choosing difficult paths when easier ones were available. It meant saying no to immediate pleasures that undermine long-term goals, and yes to challenges that most people would avoid. The destruction of the weak self was not a one-time event but an ongoing process that required constant vigilance. The comfortable patterns of thought and behavior that had created weakness in the first place possessed an almost gravitational pull, constantly trying to draw the individual back into old habits. Only through repeated acts of conscious choice, through building new patterns that reinforce strength rather than weakness, could one hope to make the transformation permanent. Yet this process, brutal as it was, contained within it the seeds of a profound liberation. As the weak self was systematically destroyed, something stronger and more authentic emerged in its place. This new self was not merely a reformed version of the old one, but something qualitatively different, a person who no longer needed external validation to feel worthy, who no longer feared failure because they had learned to see it as information rather than judgment, who no longer sought comfort above all else because they had discovered that their greatest satisfaction came from overcoming challenges rather than avoiding them. The man who had successfully destroyed his weak self became, in Machiavelli's observation, virtually immune to the manipulations and attacks that devastated others. When someone attempted to control him through fear, he recognized the tactic and refused to be swayed because he had already faced his fears and found them manageable. When others tried to seduce him with promises of easy success or immediate gratification, he remained unmoved because he had learned to value long-term achievement over short-term pleasure. When enemies attempted to destroy his reputation or circumstances, he adapted and overcame because his sense of self-worth was no longer dependent on external validation. This immunity was not born of indifference or emotional numbness. Rather, it emerged from a deep understanding of one's own capabilities and limitations, combined with the confidence that came from having repeatedly chosen strength over weakness. Such a man could still feel fear, disappointment, or pain, but these emotions no longer controlled his decisions. He had learned to experience them, acknowledge them, and then act according to his principles rather than his immediate emotional state. As Machiavelli delved deeper into these observations, he began to perceive the second great brutal reality that shaped human existence. The world was fundamentally indifferent to human desires and expectations, and only those who accepted this indifference could hope to thrive within it. This realization struck him as he reflected on the countless individuals he had observed who had been destroyed not by malicious enemies or tragic circumstances, but by their own inability to accept that reality operated according to its own laws rather than their preferences. The weak self, he noted, was characterized above all by its demand that the world conform to its desires. Such a person expected fairness where none existed, kindness where indifference prevailed, and success without the effort that success required. When reality failed to meet these expectations, as it inevitably did, the weak self responded with outrage, self-pity, or despair. These emotional responses, while understandable, were ultimately counterproductive because they prevented the individual from seeing clearly and responding effectively to actual conditions. Machiavelli had witnessed this pattern countless times in the political arena. Diplomats who expected their counterparts to honor agreements based on moral obligation rather than practical advantage found themselves betrayed and bewildered. Military commanders who believed that courage and righteousness would overcome superior numbers and resources led their men to needless slaughter. Rulers who assumed that their subjects would remain loyal out of gratitude or affection discovered too late that loyalty had to be continually earned through effective governance and strategic reward. The man who destroyed his weak self learned to see the world as it actually was rather than as he wished it to be. This clear vision was both liberating and terrible. It was liberating because it freed him from the exhausting cycle of expectation and disappointment that trapped so many others. When he no longer expected the world to be fair, he was neither surprised nor paralyzed by injustice. Instead, he could focus on navigating reality as it existed. When he no longer assumed that others would automatically respect his rights or interests, he could take appropriate measures to protect them. But this vision was also terrible because it revealed the extent to which human existence was shaped by forces beyond individual control. Weather, disease, economic fluctuations, political upheavals, and simple accidents could destroy years of careful planning in moments. Other people's decisions, made for reasons that had nothing to do with one's own interests, could fundamentally alter one's circumstances. Death could claim anyone at any time, rendering all ambitions and achievements ultimately temporary. The weak self, when confronted with this reality, typically responded in one of several unproductive ways. Some retreated into denial, constructing elaborate philosophical or religious systems that promised meaning and justice in a fundamentally meaningless and unjust universe. Others became paralyzed by nihilism, concluding that if nothing mattered ultimately, then nothing mattered immediately either. Still others oscillated between grandiose fantasies of control and crushing despair when those fantasies inevitably collapsed. The strong self, forged through the destruction of these illusions, responded differently. Rather than denying the world's indifference or being crushed by it, such a person learned to work within it skillfully. If the world was indifferent, then one's own values and goals became all the more important as sources of meaning and direction. If external circumstances were largely beyond control, then mastery of one's own responses became the primary arena for achievement. If death was inevitable, then the quality of life before death became the measure of success. This acceptance of the world's fundamental nature did not lead to passivity or resignation. On the contrary, it led to a more effective form of action because it was based on accurate rather than wishful assessment of possibilities. The man who understood that others would generally act in their own interests could structure agreements and relationships in ways that aligned those interests with his own. The man who recognized that circumstances would change could prepare for multiple contingencies rather than betting everything on a single outcome. The man who accepted that setbacks were inevitable could recover from them more quickly because he had never assumed they wouldn't occur. Machiavelli observed that this realistic approach to the world's nature created a kind of practical wisdom that was far more reliable than the idealistic approaches favored by those who had not yet destroyed their weak selves. The idealist, operating on assumptions of how the world should work, was constantly being surprised and defeated by how it actually worked. The realist, having accepted the world's true nature, could predict and prepare for likely outcomes much more effectively. This wisdom extended beyond mere tactical advantage. It created a deeper form of resilience that allowed individuals to maintain their core purposes and values even when external circumstances became hostile. Because they had never expected the world to support their goals automatically, they had developed internal sources of motivation and meaning that could sustain them through difficult periods. Because they had never assumed that success would come easily, they had built the mental and emotional strength necessary to persist through obstacles that would defeat others. The third brutal reality that emerged from Machiavelli's observations was perhaps the most paradoxical. True strength came not from avoiding weakness or failure, but from learning to transform them into sources of power. This insight ran counter to the natural human tendency to seek comfort and avoid pain, yet Machiavelli had seen its truth demonstrated repeatedly in the lives of the most successful individuals he had known. The weak self was characterized by its avoidance of anything that might reveal limitation or inadequacy. Such a person chose easy tasks to maintain an illusion of competence, surrounded themselves with flatterers to avoid uncomfortable truths, and blamed external circumstances for any failures that occurred. This strategy of avoidance created the appearance of strength while actually ensuring continued weakness, because it prevented the individual from developing the capabilities needed to handle genuine challenges. Machiavelli had observed that those who achieved lasting success followed a completely different path. Rather than avoiding their weaknesses, they sought them out deliberately. Rather than hiding from failure, they used it as information about what needed to be improved. Rather than surrounding themselves with those who confirmed their existing beliefs, they valued those who challenged them to grow stronger. This approach required a fundamental shift in how one understood weakness and failure. Instead of seeing them as evidence of personal inadequacy, they became opportunities for development. A weakness was simply an area where improvement was possible. A failure was simply feedback about which approaches didn't work, clearing the way for more effective strategies. What others saw as devastating setbacks, the strong self saw as valuable education. The process of transforming weakness into strength was not simply a matter of positive thinking or reframing. It required concrete action based on honest assessment of deficiencies. If one was weak in a particular skill, the solution was deliberate practice in that area, not rationalization or avoidance. If one was prone to specific emotional reactions that undermined effectiveness, the answer was systematic training to develop better responses, not acceptance of the limitation is unchangeable. Machiavelli noted that this transformation was particularly powerful because it created strength in precisely the areas where others expected weakness. The man who had once been defeated by fear became fearless not because he no longer felt fear, but because he had learned to act effectively despite it. The man who had once been crushed by criticism became unshakable not because he no longer heard it, but because he had learned to extract useful information from it while ignoring the rest. The man who had once been paralyzed by uncertainty became decisive not because he achieved perfect knowledge, but because he had learned to make good decisions with incomplete information. This process of transformation created a kind of anti-fragility, the ability to become stronger through stress rather than weaker. While others were weakened by challenges, criticism, and setbacks, the man who had learned to transform weakness into strength was strengthened by these same forces. Each attack that didn't destroy him revealed new ways to become more resilient. Each failure that didn't defeat him provided new knowledge about what approaches were most effective. The paradox was that this anti-fragility could only be developed by voluntarily subjecting oneself to controlled stress and challenge. One couldn't wait for difficult circumstances to arise naturally; by then, it might be too late to develop the necessary responses. Instead, one had to actively seek out opportunities to test and strengthen oneself, to discover and address weaknesses before they became critical vulnerabilities. This voluntary embrace of difficulty was one of the most counterintuitive aspects of the path Machiavelli described. The natural human tendency was to seek pleasure and avoid pain, to choose comfort over challenge, to prefer certainty over risk. Yet these natural tendencies, if followed consistently, led inevitably to weakness and vulnerability. Only by acting against these tendencies, by choosing difficulty when ease was available, by seeking challenges when comfort beckoned, by embracing uncertainty when false certainties were offered, could one develop the strength necessary to thrive in an indifferent world. The man who had successfully destroyed his weak self and built something stronger in its place became, in Machiavelli's observation, a force that others found both inspiring and intimidating. His strength was not the brittle hardness of the tyrant who ruled through fear, nor the rigid inflexibility of the fanatic who could not adapt to changing circumstances. Instead, it was the deep, flexible strength of the tree that bent without breaking, that drew nourishment from storms rather than being destroyed by them. Such strength could not be faked or imitated. It emerged only from genuine transformation, from the actual destruction of weak patterns of thought and behavior and their replacement with stronger alternatives. Others could sense this authenticity instinctively, recognizing in such a person someone who had faced the fundamental challenges of human existence and emerged victorious not through luck or circumstance, but through deliberate cultivation of internal power. As Machiavelli continued his reflections through the long nights of his exile, he began to understand that the principles he was discovering had applications far beyond the political realm that had been his primary concern. In every area of human endeavor, business, relationships, artistic creation, military affairs, scholarship, the same patterns held true. Those who refused to destroy their weak selves remained vulnerable to destruction by others. Those who accepted the world's indifference and learned to work within it achieved more than those who demanded that reality conform to their wishes. Those who learned to transform weakness into strength became anti-fragile, growing stronger through the very forces that weaken others. The implications of these insights were both profound and disturbing. They suggested that most human suffering was self-inflicted, not through malice or stupidity, but through the natural tendency to cling to comfortable illusions rather than face difficult truths. They implied that the path to genuine strength and resilience was available to anyone willing to pay the price in temporary discomfort and ego death that the transformation required. Yet they also suggested that this path would always be taken by a relative few, because it demanded a level of honesty and courage that most people found unbearable. The majority would continue to seek external solutions to internal problems, to blame circumstances for outcomes they had the power to influence, and to remain vulnerable to manipulation and defeat because they had never developed true internal strength. This recognition filled Machiavelli with a complex mixture of hope and melancholy. Hope, because he had discovered principles that could genuinely improve human life for those willing to apply them. Melancholy, because he understood how few would have the courage to undertake the necessary transformation. The path to strength was not hidden or secret, it was simply too difficult for most people to follow consistently. In the quiet hours before dawn, as shadows gradually gave way to the pale light of another Tuscan morning, Machiavelli would sometimes pause in his writing to contemplate the full significance of what he had discovered. These brutal realities, that internal weakness was the greatest threat to any individual, that the world was fundamentally indifferent to human desires, that strength could only be built through the voluntary embrace of difficulty, were not merely theoretical insights. They were practical tools that could transform not only individual lives but entire societies. A nation composed of individuals who had destroyed their weak selves would be virtually unconquerable. A culture that encouraged its members to face reality clearly rather than retreat into comforting illusions would be more prosperous and resilient than one that prioritized pleasant falsehoods. A civilization that understood how to transform weakness into strength would continue to grow and adapt while others stagnated and declined. Yet the very forces that made these transformations possible also ensured that they would be rare. The destruction of the weak self was not something that could be imposed from outside. It had to be chosen freely by each individual. The acceptance of the world's indifference could not be taught as mere intellectual knowledge, it had to be learned through direct experience of how reality actually operated. The skill of transforming weakness into strength could not be acquired through theory alone, it required repeated practice under real conditions where failure had genuine consequences. This meant that the strongest individuals and societies would always be those that had voluntarily undertaken the most difficult path, that had chosen temporary pain over permanent weakness, that had preferred hard truths over comfortable lies. They would be distinguished not by their advantages in resources or circumstances, but by their willingness to develop internal capabilities that others found too demanding to pursue. As the morning light grew stronger and the sounds of daily life began to drift through his window, Machiavelli understood that he had uncovered something that transcended the immediate political concerns that had originally motivated his inquiry. He had discovered principles of human strength and resilience that were as fundamental as the laws that governed the movement of celestial bodies or the growth of living things. These principles operated whether people recognized them or not, whether they accepted them or not, whether they liked them or not. The man who learned to work with these principles rather than against them gained access to a form of power that was both more subtle and more enduring than the crude force that most people associated with strength. It was the power of someone who could not be broken because he had already broken himself and rebuilt something stronger. It was the power of someone who could not be surprised by adversity because he had learned to expect and prepare for it. It was the power of someone who grew stronger through challenge rather than weaker, who found opportunity in crisis rather than only threat. Such power could not be taken away by external force because it resided not in circumstances but in the individual's capacity to respond effectively to whatever circumstances arose. It could not be destroyed by the attacks of enemies because it was built upon a foundation of self-knowledge and internal strength rather than external validation. It could not be diminished by failure because it had learned to extract value and wisdom from every experience, whether immediately pleasant or painful. This was the ultimate brutal reality that Machiavelli perceived as he neared the end of his extended meditation on power, weakness, and human nature. The strongest form of strength was that which had been forged in the furnace of voluntary difficulty, tempered by honest self-assessment, and refined through the systematic transformation of weakness into power. Such strength belonged fully to the individual who had developed it and could neither be granted by others nor taken away by them. The man who had undergone this transformation might still face external defeats, his armies might be routed, his wealth might be lost, his reputation might be destroyed, his very life might be ended. But he could not be truly conquered because the essence of who he was resided in capacities that existed independently of external circumstances. He had become unconquerable not because he was invulnerable to harm, but because harm could no longer destroy what mattered most about him. In recognizing this truth, Machiavelli understood that he had discovered not merely a strategy for political success, but a path to a form of human flourishing that was available to anyone with the courage to pursue it. The brutal realities of existence, the inevitability of conflict, the indifference of the world, the necessity of struggle, were not obstacles to human happiness but the very conditions that made the highest forms of human achievement possible. Only by facing these realities directly, by refusing the comfort of illusions and the safety of mediocrity, could an individual discover what they were truly capable of becoming. Only by destroying the weak self that sought ease above all else could one build the strong self that found meaning in challenge and growth. Only by accepting that the world would never automatically provide what one wanted could one develop the skills necessary to create value and meaning through one's own efforts. As the sun climbed higher in the morning sky and the the demands of ordinary life began to assert themselves once more. Machiavelli set down his quill with the satisfaction of someone who had glimpsed a profound truth about the human condition. He had seen clearly, perhaps for the first time, why some individuals achieved greatness while others remained trapped in weakness and mediocrity. He had understood the mechanism by which human beings could transcend their natural limitations and create something larger than themselves. The path was clear, though difficult. The price was high, though paid willingly by those who understood its value. The reward was certain, though it came in forms that the weak self could never have imagined or appreciated. For the man who destroyed his weak self and built something stronger in its place had gained something more precious than wealth, more enduring than fame, and more valuable than any external achievement. He had gained himself, fully and completely, as a conscious creator of his own destiny rather than a victim of circumstances beyond his control. This was the ultimate insight that emerged from Machiavelli's long meditation on power and human nature. Strength was not something one possessed, but something one became. It was not a quality that could be acquired through external means, but a transformation that had to be undergone from within. It was not a destination that could be reached, but a way of being that had to be continuously chosen and renewed. The man who understood this truth and acted upon it consistently had achieved something that no external force could take away from him. He had become, in the deepest sense, truly free, not because he was exempt from the constraints that bound all human beings, but because he had learned to find opportunity and meaning within those constraints. He had become truly strong, not because he was invulnerable to harm, but because he could transform any harm that did not destroy him into a source of greater strength. In this way, the brutal realities that broke weaker spirits became the very foundation upon which stronger ones built their power. The indifference of the world, the inevitability of conflict, the certainty of death, these were no longer sources of despair but reminders of what made life precious and achievement meaningful. They were the conditions that separated those who would remain forever weak from those who would become forever strong. The man who had undergone this transformation lived in the same world as everyone else, subject to the same physical laws, vulnerable to the same ultimate fate. But he experienced this world differently, moved through it with different purposes, and left behind him different traces of his passage. Where others saw only obstacles, he saw opportunities for growth. Where others experienced only suffering, he found lessons in resilience. Where others faced only endings, he discovered new beginnings. This transformation was available to any individual willing to pay its price, but that price was steep enough to ensure that few would choose to pay it. It required the death of everything weak and comfortable in oneself, the acceptance of a world that cared nothing for one's preferences, and the voluntary embrace of difficulty as a path to strength. Most people, faced with such requirements, would choose to remain as they were rather than undertake the arduous journey to become what they could be. Yet for those who did choose this path, who did destroy their weak selves and build something stronger in their place, the reward was a form of human flourishing that transcended ordinary limitations. They became examples of what human beings could achieve when they refused to accept weakness as permanent, when they declined to blame circumstances for outcomes they could influence, when they chose growth over comfort and meaning over ease. Such individuals might never be numerous, but their influence extended far beyond their numbers. They became sources of inspiration and possibility for others, living demonstrations that the highest human potentials were achievable through choice and effort rather than luck or circumstance. They proved that strength was not the privilege of the few but the birthright of anyone willing to claim it through the systematic destruction of everything weak within themselves. In the end, this was Machiavelli's greatest insight, that the brutal realities of existence, far from being obstacles to human greatness, were actually its prerequisites. Only in a world where strength had to be earned rather than given, where victory required genuine capability rather than wishful thinking, where power came through transformation rather than inheritance, could human beings discover their true potential and achieve lasting significance. The man who destroyed his weak self had simply chosen to align himself with these fundamental principles rather than fight against them. In doing so, he had discovered not only how to survive in a difficult world, but how to thrive within it and ultimately transcend its limitations through the strength he had forged within himself.